Hello and welcome to Drishti IAS. My name is Saloni Nankyolier and we know that the 17th edition of BRICS Summit took place from 6th to 7th of July in Brazil, and the BRICS nations have highly condemned and rejected European Union's CBAM or Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Now in this video, we will understand what CBAM is all about and what are the apprehensions of these developing nations behind accepting this. So the BRICS nations have condemned and rejected CBAM of the EU or any other similar trade policy of any other country. And what is the reason of developing nations to do so? For this, we first need to understand what CBAM is. So CBAM or Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism is actually a climate-linked tariff where the importers have to pay for the carbon emissions of these imported products, especially from the carbon-intensive industries. And these carbon-intensive industries are the industries that produce a lot of CO2. They emit a lot of CO2, a lot of greenhouse gases. They bring about global warming and climate change. For example, power and energy sector, iron and steel. So these are some top emitters. Cement, aluminium, fertilizers, and a lot more. These industries emit huge amounts of CO2, huge amounts of greenhouse gases, and the goal of CBAM is to move towards clean energy, cleaner environment, so that the CO2 emissions go down, GHG emissions go down, and we can tackle the negative effects of climate change. In fact, EU talks about something which is known as carbon leakage. And what is this carbon leakage? It is actually a process of translocation of an industry from a country where the tax emissions or the carbon emission rules were very high, very strict, to a nation where the carbon emission rules were very relaxed. For example, carbon emission rules are very strict in European Union, so these industries can translocate from European Union to a developing nation like India or China where these rules are very relaxed. So the goal is not being served, because what was the goal? Goal was to move towards a cleaner energy, to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. Did we do that? Did we achieve that? No. Instead, what we did, we only relocated our industry from a country where the rules were very strict to a country where the rules were very relaxed. So the GHG emissions actually, they either remained same or even increased, but they did not reduce. So our end goal here was not served. And the European Union wants to level the playing field between EU and foreign exporters. Because what is going to happen if you move your production houses to a country where the tax rules or regulations, the emission regulations, they are very relaxed, the products are going to be cheaper because they do not have to pay that high carbon tax. So the product is going to be cheaper in comparison to the product that was domestically produced in the European Union countries. So naturally, people are going to be drawn more towards the imported products instead of their own homegrown products. So by adjusting this border, by adjusting this mechanism, European Union aims to level the playing field between EU or the domestic producers and foreign exporters. It does that by issuing carbon certificates to match the emission levels of the goods they import. So how does this work? It works on calculating the tons of CO2 emitted. So a good that is produced in a country of European Union where the regulations are very strict, the tons of CO2 that are emitted will be calculated there, and the tons of CO2 emitted on a product which is produced in India or China will be calculated. The difference will be taken out, and that difference is going to be multiplied by the current carbon price. So by that, so the difference that comes out to be that amount will have to be paid by the importer while importing that product from the foreign market. So the price of that imported product is going to go up, and now there will be a level playing field established between the domestic product and the imported product, and the goal will be served. Now, if we look at the response of the BRICS nation, so the BRICS nation, they condemned it, they rejected it because they call it unilateral, punitive and protectionist. So these developed nations, they have already caused a lot of climate change. They went through industrial revolution, they modernized their industries, they caused a lot of climate change, a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, and now they want the developing nations to be on the same level when dealing with climate change. So this is termed as something that is unilateral, something that is not responsible, and something that is not equitable in itself, because the developed nations have already grown at the expense of the environment. And now the developing nations are expected to deal with climate change on similar terms as the developed nations. And if they're not able to do that, they are being punished by these carbon border adjustment mechanisms. This undermines equity in climate action. What is climate equity? So it tells us that climate change, like everybody is not equally responsible, or every country is not equally responsible for climate change. So the responsibility of every country in tackling climate change should also be different, because not every country is well equipped in dealing with climate change. So all these things need to be taken into consideration, and this is what climate equity talks about. It says that it undermines climate equity, it violates international trade and climate agreement. If you recall the Paris Agreement, it talks about CBDR, which is common but differentiated responsibility. Like everybody has a responsibility of tackling with climate change, because everybody has to do that. We have to move towards clean energy. But we also need to understand that while we have the similar responsibility, it is also differentiated, because we do not have that high sophisticated decarbonizing technology with us at the moment. We'll have to invest a lot, and right now the developing nations are already struggling with things like high unemployment, high poverty, less modernization, less industrialization. So we already are struggling with a lot of things. And right now, while climate change, tackling climate change is definitely our goal, but the transition to move towards clean energy, it should be just and equitable. Now, if we look at the reaction and steps that are taken by the developing nations, so India and China and the basic group is Brazil, South Africa, India, and China. So they have consistently opposed, time and again they have opposed CBAM at climate forums like COP27, 28 and 29, because it violates Paris Agreement's principle of common but differentiated responsibility. But EU is not alone in CBAM. In fact, UK and Canada are also considering something similar to CBAM. There's a global trend of green protectionism. So they're protecting their own domestic industries, protecting their own domestic producers, and imposing taxes on the importers. The US Inflation Reduction Act also offers domestic subsidies for green tech, and it acts as a non-tariff climate-related trade measure, because we are providing subsidies to our domestic producers. So our products that are domestically grown will have lesser prices, and then they will be competitive with the imported goods. And the EU also bans imports from products that are linked to illegally harvested forests or illegally deforested land, another example of climate related trade rules. Now if we look at the global impact of CBAM, so there are some things that could happen, that it could disrupt the trade facilities or trade policies, because it is kind of against WTO's most favored nation, where every country has to get equitable treatment. But now what is happening? The countries which have the capacity of decarbonizing their industries, they have the capacity to produce less carbon intensive products, they are going to be benefited by this. But the countries, the developing nations like India and China, which cannot really invest a lot right now into this technology, they are not going to benefit from it. So it is not in consideration with the most favored nation. It violates those principles. It can incentivize cleaner production in the long term, definitely, but it is going to risk economic loss and inequality at the short term. And it can spark retaliatory trade barriers also and disputes in the World Trade Organization. So what is going to be our way forward? We definitely need to move towards clean energy. We definitely need to control our climate change, but we need to focus on climate financing, just transition, just and fair transition, climate financing, technology transfer and support. And rather than punitive measures, we need to be flexible and supportive in our approach. The developed nations need to understand that they have grown at the expense of the climate, and now they need to support and be flexible with the developing nations. Multilateral frameworks may be necessary to balance climate responsibility with equity and fair trade. So that was all for today's video. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. And now let us look at a question for prelims. Consider the following statements regarding the carbon border adjustment mechanism. CBAM is a tariff imposed by European Union on imports based on the carbon emissions embedded in their production process. CBAM applies only to products originating from developed countries with high per capita emissions. Paris Agreement follows differential treatment of developing countries in response measures related to climate change. Which of the statements is or are correct? A, 1 and 2 only, B, 1, 2 and 3 only, C, 1 and 3 only, and D, 2 only. Please provide your answers in the comment section and I will pin down the correct one. Thank you.
For more informative content, like, share and subscribe, and do not forget to press the bell icon to get the notifications.